good morning. We are so thrilled that you are here with us for our second day of the Master Gardener Advanced Training Conference given on the virtual platform. And we had a great day of learning yesterday. Highlights included Carrie Harmon, Mark Frank, Dr. Enlow. We just had amazing speakers, and I think we had a really good connection even though we were on the virtual platform. I know we had some technical issues along the way, but we are working and figuring them out and trying to do the best we can for that. And I wanted to let you know, and I'll say this again, we are going to be able to get our registered participants early access to all the recordings and the PDFs as they're available. And we really are going to aim to do that in the next couple of weeks. And then we will make the sessions available to the public in January, February of 2022. So I want to get this information in your hands because I know you can't attend all the sessions or you maybe had trouble. So we want to make sure that you get those as soon as possible. So this morning, I'm going to show you teams again. We're going to look at that one screen, and drum roll, please. We have the Horticulture ID contest winners, and then I will introduce Dr. Rick Schoellhorn, and he will get going. So I want to give as much time to Rick as possible, so we're going to keep on trucking. So I again want to say thank you to the Master Gardeners for attending, and thank you to Emily and all the moderators and organizers yesterday. I think you did a fantastic job. Thank you so much for your generosity and your expertise and working in these virtual platforms and making it feel like we're actually in a classroom together. And after yesterday, I was a little stressed. And so all I need is this plant and that other plant and those plants over there. I like to say we are a support group for plant junkies. And I needed a little plants therapy yesterday afternoon. I don't know about you. So on this team's meetings page, the 3 dots here will take you to your drop-down menu so you can look at your device settings for audio. And then the 3 dots will also take you to your device for your view or your gallery. So that can help set that view up. So if you're having trouble seeing the slides or visualizing, check that out for your gallery and then click through there until you find something that works. Also, the camera button is here and the mute button is there. And then if you want to say something or use an emoji, you click here and you get a thumbs up, you get a little heart, you get a laugh, you get applause, and you can also raise your hand. So that's a neat way to do the teams. All right, are you ready? Drum roll, please. We had 110 responses to the Horticulture ID contest. So we set this up online. It was kind of a matching contest. I tried to find the hardest pictures I could. I tried to find confusing pictures because I knew online it would be a little bit easier. So for our individual scores out of 40, our second place winner is Kathy Glenn from Sarasota County with a score of 39. Congratulations. Tied for second place is Kathy Fanning from Alachua County with a tie of score of 39. And in first place for individuals, drum roll, Ann Madden, Sarasota County. Great job, Ann. She got them all right out of 40. So proud of her. Okay, the team score. So we took the top 4 persons and combined their scores and took an average. And that's how we do it in the regular contest too. And third place, Polk County with a score of 35.75, the team Cindy, Jane, Sue, and Patricia. Great job, y'all. Second place, Sarasota County, score of 37.75, Ann, Kathy, Eva T, and Jill. Great job. And drum roll, please. Are you ready? I am. I've been waiting for this a long time. First place, Alachua County. Total score or average score of 39, Kathy Fanning, Ann Hudson, Greg McGann, and Lewis McNamara. Congratulations, y'all. And congratulations to everyone who participated. You did a fantastic job. And I hope that this inspires you to do a little bit more plant ID and be able to come to the in-person contest that we will be having next year in Kissimmee, third week of October at the Embassy Suites, where we're all getting back together. And hopefully we can shake hands and hug and really enjoy that opportunity. But I want to, my hats off to Sarasota, Polk County, Alachua County, and our individual winners. Fantastic job. Okay. Oh, speaker update. Dr. Chris Wilson, who was going to do the soils talk, which we were all very much looking forward to. He called in today and he is too ill to do the talk. He said he would record it for us at a later date. So that will be included in your recordings when he's feeling better. You know, he just feels good and doesn't feel good and does not feel comfortable coming into the office. If you all know what I mean, you know, we don't know these days. So the recordings will go out and Dr. Chris Wilson's will be included. So we just hope that he has a speedy recovery. Exactly. All right. It's exciting. Please welcome Dr. Rick Schoellhorn. He is a plant lover. He's a plant enthusiast. He's contagious, you guys. He's contagious. It just gets on you. And you know, you find yourself saying, oh, I'm going to buy this plant because Dr. Rick said I should. Or, you know, you're snipping a little cutting from Chanticleer because it was in one of Rick's talks. And the people are clearing their throats, you know, excuse me, madam, this is a private garden. I'm like, I'm empowered by Rick Schoellhorn. I can do whatever I want. He said I needed this plant. I need Begonia boliviensis. So he worked at the University of Florida. For those of you who love Mark Frank, he was Mark's graduate advisor. So it is contagious. He also worked at other universities as well, but his last post was at the University of Florida here in Gainesville. He went on after that to work for proven winners. And he basically at that point did what we all dream of, traveled around the world, met with other plant enthusiasts, and found the best plants on the globe to bring into production and horticulture in the United States of America. I mean, is that not our dream? So Rick has traveled basically to almost every continent. They didn't go to Antarctica. They do have plants there, but lichen does not grow in our gardens, so he did not want to bring that back to us. He's an internationally known speaker. Sorry for the typo, guys. I'll click off. And author of one of our favorite books, which is Perennials for Florida. And Rick, I picked a fun picture of you and some very sexy begonias. I hope you still have some of this going on. Very good.
Thank you, Wendy. Oh man, that's great. I am so proud of Mark Frank, and I have no right to be. He was already an amazing plantsman before he was in graduate school with me, and he's just grown into an even better educator. So it's just thrilling to see his career go on. So yay. And everyone, all the master gardeners in the state, thank you guys for what you do and how you communicate to the average consumer. You guys have more impact than anybody else. And it's so critical that you have the research background and information to work with, because even though you think gardening's a fairly straightforward, simple thing, man, does it get confused out there if gossip runs the show. So there's a lot of interesting stuff. I'll try to talk about some of it today, but there's a lot of new stuff coming out. There's a lot of changes in the industry. And you guys need to know all that because in the end, you're the ones who are on the front line with gardeners around the United States. So just know I am honored to be an honorary master gardener in Santa Rosa County, and loved my time out in the Panhandle working with everybody in all the counties out there too. So yeah, okay. So I'm going to try and learn how to use Teams and start my presentation here. And there we go. Wendy, is that up and looking correct?
And looks exactly like we did when you practiced. So you're
Great.
100% good to go. I'm going to go ahead and mute now.
Okay. All right. So what I'm going to be talking about today is some of the new plant material that's coming out, but really, as much as anything, just kind of wanted to also do some sort of state of the industry discussion. And so let's take a quick look at what's going on in the industry today. And the odd but very good news is apparently pandemics are like the best thing that ever happened to horticulture. And, you know, our industry has been, I don't want to say whining because they have a lot of rights to their somewhat dismal outlook, but they haven't been very upbeat. Boy, the last 2 years, people who you haven't seen smile in a decade, just grinning from ear to ear because people buy plants when they stay home. And so it has been just an explosion of business for a lot of people. And that's good. So it helps sort of fuel the industry going forward. In terms of the overall trends in the industry, it doesn't change a whole lot, but as far as seeing happy people in your industry, it's wonderful. So most of the nurseries are recording record great sales, and part of that is the nesting. Everybody stays home and gardens. A big part of it is the vegetable gardening boom, or I like to think of it as emergency rations, because for most people, that is the single most expensive tomato they will ever eat, the one they grew themselves. So the other thing that's interesting, and this kind of goes along with the trend we'll talk about in the next slide, is that we are moving again away from independent garden centers, and there's this growth of virtual nurseries. And this is, it's interesting, but it's kind of disturbing at the same time, in the sense that we're losing brick and mortar independent garden centers and we're getting people who are on the internet, but they're only on the internet as long as they need to be, and then they disappear. So it's really not something we can rely on as far as nurseries there. And then the whole, I don't know any other word for it, but the whole crazy boom of people buying spotted begonias and monsteras with holes in the leaves, or variegated monstera deliciosa. And people are paying insane amounts of money for these plants. And on one hand, that's very good because it's raising the price point of plants, which from the industry side of things, we need to do. But on the other, there was a philodendron sold on eBay the other day for $70,000, the price of a house. And, well, maybe a very small house. But anyway, it's impossible for me to understand how someone, A, has that much money around to buy a plant, but what do they buy it for? And in some cases, they buy it to be the person who propagates it and sells more of it and maybe makes their money back. But in general, a lot of the motivation of this new explosion of high value plants is sheerly to say you're one of the first people to have it. And so it's very interesting and very different model of plant purchasing than a regular garden center where you're buying it to put it in your yard to have it for the season, and then you'll be back at the end of the season to find something else. And so the explosion of internet sales, I think, is fascinating. It's hard to imagine that it's sustaining, but at least for now, there are some people who are making very good money, and others who are sort of following on the back of this trend. Smaller nurseries are able to take, let's say, a spotted begonia, and instead of selling it for $300, they're selling it for $15 or $20, which is still 4 to 5 times what they were selling it for 2 years ago. So there's this surge of expenditure and price that goes along with this this sort of craziness, and it makes me think of, because I've been studying a lot of horticultural history lately, it makes me think of tulipomania, where all of a sudden tulips were the most popular thing in Europe, and the aristocracy was spending, a small country's entire economic budget to get the parrot virus-infected tulip that would give the unique color. And it's really the same sort of thing, this sort of fashion that drives super high pricing on plants. And then as far as COVID and the rest of it, will life ever be normal again? I have no idea. But like Wendy, I'm hoping next year we can all be hugging again. I kind of miss life like that. So yeah, we'll see where all of this goes. In general, the industry is continuing to simplify. And what I mean by that is that all of the little independent nurseries are slowly disappearing. And the end result is that plant materials are being purchased through big box stores, grocery stores in the spring. And so you've got fewer outlets selling more plants, but much less diversity in plants. And so it's changing the dynamic a lot. And with the independents, the mom and pops, the pressure on those nurseries is that they need to provide something you can't get at a big box store. And that's a fairly tall order. We used to think it was going to be simple. 20 years ago, we used to think, oh, the big box stores, they're never going to articulate their gardening section enough to have an impact. But that wasn't true. They did. They didn't even have to improve it nearly as much as we thought. And most people would begin to walk into the big box store to buy their plants, then go to the independent nursery and say, well, that just looks like the same thing I could have gotten at XYZ big box store, and it costs $2 more. And so that just sort of escalated this landslide of mom and pop nurseries disappearing and more business being made through the big box stores. It's not a trend I like, because I like diversity in plant material. The other thing that I think, in listening to you guys chat before I began my presentation, is talking about native plants. And when you're looking at not just native, but maybe very specific ecotypes, you've got to have smaller nurseries that are producing it, because their market is limited to a certain region of the state, or maybe just the state. And big box stores buy regionally. They don't look for that specific region to sell to. They're looking for something that sells over the whole market. Now, why is that important to master gardeners? Well, I think the main thing that this simplification means is that I remember when I first found peonies for sale in Florida, which is a plant that is gorgeous if you live in the northern tier of the United States, but doesn't live in Florida, purchased by one of the regional purchasing companies for big box sales. And so there's going to be a lot of things that come into your areas as master gardeners, and that doesn't grow here. And you'll have to explain that to consumers who took it home and said, but it says it's a perennial. And you'll need to be able to explain to them that, yes, it's a perennial in Minnesota. And I know you guys know how to do that. So it's just more complications there for you guys to look forward to. And one of the other things that comes to mind for the way the market is changing, and this has been for the past 25 or 30 years, is the whole seed versus vegetative crops and how that impacts what's available on the market. And usually when the industry is feeling especially poor, they shift to seed produced crops because seed is much cheaper to grow. It's easier to store, so that if your sales aren't very good a given year, you can just hold the seed and sell it the next year. So seed offers flexibility and it's cheaper. And on the downside, you can't really protect it or patent it because seed crops are not patentable currently. And usually with seed crops, and this is another aspect of life for master gardeners, is if something is produced by seed, then very likely it's also going to be a plant that generates seed. And when it starts to generate seed, it's pulling energy away from new flowers and new growth. And so when it's really obvious that a plant is producing seed at the expense of everything else, you call it determinate, like tomato plants, where they set fruit and then the plant just collapses around the fruit that it has as it ripens. Or in some cases, you have indeterminate seed varieties. And an indeterminate variety means that it sets fruit, but keeps growing and keeps flowering. So kind of interesting in terms of seed crops, how that works. With vegetative crops, it's clonal reproduction. So the plants have to be instituted into tissue culture, cleaned of viruses, and then grown and produced as stock plants in sterile conditions. And it's a lot more expensive, as you can imagine, than holding onto a bag of seed. So vegetative crops are more expensive. You almost have to patent it anymore because one of the other changes in the horticulture industry is that people have become very possessive if they do something that is unique or new. In order to protect that innovation against just being stolen and remarketed, they're reverting to patents. And then patents were not enough. So now they've started to look at utility patents, which means that simply you can't legally, commercially propagate anything, but you also can't breed with it. So a utility patent is about 10 times more money than a patent, maybe 10 to 20 times more money. But it allows you to protect not only your innovation, but people who want to breed with it. And then, of course, in order to do that, you have to be able to mark the DNA of the plant that you have the records to prove that the DNA of your plant is different. It really becomes much more involved. And as everything gets simpler and the companies are fewer but larger, they're willing to invest in more legal means of controlling not only their plants, but also their competition. If you don't like somebody in the big bruiser world of corporate horticulture, you just continue to sue them year after year, and the person with the most money wins. So you'll see a lot of that sort of mentality in horticulture right now as well. Probably one of the best examples of seed versus vegetative are impatiens. And seed grown impatiens, you may or may not have noticed, have somewhat disappeared. And what instead has become much more popular are the sun patiens, which are easily confused with New Guinea impatiens. And so the differences are the seed varieties of impatiens, let's see, Walleriana. Impatiens Walleriana had powdery mildew show up in propagation of the seedlings and plugs in Florida. Florida then shipped it to the rest of the United States, spread it all around. The rest of the United States planted them and infected all their flower beds with downy mildew. And all of a sudden, you couldn't get seed impatiens anymore. And instead, you could only get the New Guinea or sun patiens. And there's starting to be some new emerging varieties that are supposed to be better. But the interesting part is, if you can get the old seed impatiens, downy mildew doesn't seem to be a problem anymore. So at least from what I've seen, it was kind of a perfect storm situation. And downy mildew is not quite the issue it used to be. So as you look at, as a master gardener, a lot of these different plants, seed or vegetative, what you'll find is that seed varieties tend to die earlier and set seed and die earlier. As they die, they tend to show more disease symptoms because overall their vigor is declining as they finish developing their seed. Most clonal varieties, and not all by any means, but many of them are sterile, so they tend to go longer with flowers and growth than their seed counterparts. So you can see in some cases where this will help you guys on a diagnostic level to know a little bit about the history of the plant that you're looking at, and therefore maybe it's not so unreasonable that it looks bad in July because it is a plant that normally sets seed and dies by that point. So anyway, I enjoyed looking at both of these types of plants. There's some absolutely fabulous plants in both categories. So the other thing, and this is another question that remains kind of a constant and fairly volatile issue, is GMO versus GEO. And the story I like to tell on this is that I was given the name of a woman who was speaking in the Midwest as a garden expert, who had been telling all of her audiences that Olive Proven Winners, who I worked for at the time, Olive Proven Winners plants were GMO, and that you had to spray them with Roundup to make them bloom. And it's just wrong on so many levels. It was hard to know where to start. And so I called the woman and I said, so I hear this is what you're saying. And she said, oh, yes, I've heard that. It's true. And I asked her, where did she hear it? And she said, someone told me. And we looked and she never had more than that. It was pretty much that. And I said, well, it's not true. And if you spray our plants with Roundup, they die just like everybody else's would. And she was very apologetic and very nice, and she agreed to change her talks. And I said, really, you can prove it to yourself. Don't just take my word for it. And but it was an example of someone who was not research-based in what they were doing, talking to a lot of gardeners in the Midwest. And the idea of, well, yeah, it made me feel bad to think of proven winners plants sprayed with Roundup in order to make them bloom. But it was more interesting to me that her understanding of those issues was not good enough to actually make that decision herself. When it comes to GEO plants, genetically engineered plants, you won't find them in floriculture or horticulture. You'll find them in agriculture because the markets are so hugely different in size. We can't afford GEOs in nurseries and the ornamental industry. Our markets are way too small. But we did get one genetically engineered plant by mistake. So orange petunias, it turned out, were genetically engineered. Back in the 1960s, someone had inserted tomato DNA into a petunia in the Netherlands and created an orange flowered petunia. There aren't any naturally orange flowered petunias. So in 1965, they put this plant out in their trials at the university, but somehow very shortly thereafter, the plant was in Japan and the Japanese breeders started breeding with it. And when they showed the plants in their trials, suddenly it ended up back in Europe again, showing up, and then into America. And so the USDA issued an announcement saying that all plants that showed this DNA, all petunia plants, had to be removed from the market. So this was probably about 8 or 9 years ago, and all of the orange petunias, which had just really kind of begun to catch on as their own color category, all had to be removed. But then the real work came when they had to do DNA analysis of all of your petunias to see if you had that DNA showing up when it wasn't orange. And so it actually turned out that the DNA from that particular plant was showing up in a variety of different petunias of different colors as well. All of those had to be removed from the market. So, so we had this one GEO in horticulture, and it turned into a major disaster. And probably about 25% of the petunia cultivars being sold at the time had to be pulled and replaced with other genetics. So it's interesting. But in general, you will find that GEO plants don't work in horticulture. They're too expensive to get the patents, to get the protection, to get the government paperwork finished is so expensive that there's no flower sold that makes enough money to merit it at this point. So genetically modified versus genetically engineered, that's kind of the way the terminology has gone for these plants. GMO just means man modified the DNA, but GEO means man inserted foreign DNA into the plant that did not belong in the plant. So in other words, if you're a plant breeder, you're constantly changing the DNA of the plants because you're hybridizing them. So all ornamental plants pretty much are GMO. They've been modified over years of hybridizing, but that's very different than inserting different DNA from other plants or organisms into the plant that you're talking about. And again, it's just a matter of market size. I firmly believe that if it was cheaper, horticulture would be all over GEO plants because they would have been Roundup ready everything if they could have, but they couldn't afford it. the industry as a whole could not afford it. So it's interesting when you see these things, and really when it comes to the ornamental stuff, for the most part, if a plant is an incredible performer, it's probably because of its genetics, not because it has had something inserted into its genetics. And so anyway, kind of interesting, and I love the story about all the proven winners plants have to be sprayed with Roundup in order to bloom because they're so good. Oh, that's nice. Okay. I can be flattered by that. Okay, keeping Florida in perspective, one of the things that you guys may or may not be aware of is how unique Florida is for the United States as far as our climate. Granted, we all like the fact that it doesn't freeze much in winter, and we put up with the heat and humidity of summer, but it makes us a very interesting place to grow plants. Downy mildew, which we talked about in Impatiens, downy mildew prefers cool, moist conditions. So it's perfect for Florida in spring, but by the time you get to Florida in summer, the temperatures are too high for downy mildew. So it's not the issue in Florida that it was up in the north when they shipped plants out of Florida. Xanthomonas is pretty much everywhere in Florida, and whenever it rains, it's splashed on the foliage of plants. So most of the plants that do well in Florida are somewhat tolerant of Xanthomonas. Otherwise, they disappear. Powdery mildew comes and goes. It's always changing. Nematodes continues to be a big issue, but it's so specific to the southern states that the industry in general doesn't consider it worth screening for. So nematode sensitivity, you'll find there's not a whole lot of awareness for it. But our heat stress and our temperatures, excuse me, are both good and bad. The main thing is to keep it in perspective. When it comes to the retail industry, Florida is a tiny state because Florida, like Southern California, people can grow plants almost all year round, which means people don't buy plants very often or as often as they do up north, where their entire garden is frozen to the ground and then they start over every year. Those are the markets that the industry focuses on. So when it comes to what does good in Florida, most of the international breeding and horticulture companies don't really care. As long as Florida can produce the liners and ship them to the rest of the country, that's okay. But what Florida consumers want is not as important. So that means you guys and your recommendations become even more important for Florida consumers. However, so Florida as a producer of plants has a huge impact. Florida and Texas both are the primary early season suppliers for the whole horticulture industry farther north. And so we have a very big impact there. And when it comes to diseases, we're usually the first guys on the firing line because we produce the plants and ship them to everybody else. So downy mildew, Rostonia, those were all problems where Florida gets the blame because Florida is the propagator for so many other states. The other thing as we move forward as an industry is the international linkages that go along with the industry. And so global partnerships, import and export restrictions, pesticide uses, shipping costs, all of that began to play roles in whether plants are available or not. Currently, most geraniums grown in the United States are produced in Africa because Africa is hot and dry, and without the humidity, a lot of the bad diseases don't show up because the conditions aren't hospitable for them. It doesn't work for everything, but it helps. It's also, Africa is extremely cheap labor, and they're still using pesticides that we've outlawed 20 to 40 years ago. So we are going to third world countries to produce the flowers that we bring back to the United States to grow for our gardens. The same is true for Latin America. Europe used to work in Spain and Portugal for their plant production, the same way that the United States used Mexico. But it's moved even farther south in order to get longer seasons of production. And so for a lot of companies, Costa Rica becomes extremely important because that's where all of their production facilities are. They may be selling the plants in the United States, but they're getting all of their unrooted cuttings from Costa Rica. And it's the same for seed because land is too expensive in the United States to do acres of California poppy or zinnia or whatever flower. But if you go to third world countries, that becomes a very viable way to produce seed. So a lot of the flocks that you see on the Florida roadways from Florida DOT is from plants grown in Costa Rica and Mexico. The seed is harvested, and then FDOT spreads it on the sides of the road. It's still Phlox drumondii. It still came from the United States because most phlox is from the United States, but it's traveled back and forth across the equator before it finds its home ultimately. So it's interesting to see how much of all of that is in the future and ongoing with horticulture. And now maybe to the part that you're probably most interested in, which is new flowers. But to me, the industry is fascinating. The industry is definitely under an extreme pressure to change. And so you can expect to see more and more small nurseries closing because it's too hard to make money in the current climate. It's interesting to see all the nurseries that were sold to become cannabis producers. And most of those nurseries, the original owners are now gone and they're owned by banks and financiers. So it's horticulture again sort of took a step back. I don't think we will, at least in central North Florida, it'll be many years before we recover from the loss of Grandiflora Nursery and all the diversity they provided us. Instead, now we have much less diversity, and it's harder to find many things native and non-native. Okay, so we're going to take a quick walk through what is new. And Wendy, how am I doing on time?
Pretty good. You got about 17 minutes.
Perfect.
To get through these guys. Yep.
Okay, thanks. Okay. So when you look at plant breeding companies in the world, Suntory in Japan is probably one of the leaders. And Suntory is the biggest alcohol producer in Japan. So they are doing plants as a hobby compared to their big money, which is alcohol sales. And it's interesting because they actually did buy a GEO laboratory so they could have blue roses in their corporate office building's lobby. So the GEO that was done was the insertion of delphinium genetics into roses to give blue colors in the roses. And the plants that were produced were exclusively used in Suntory's lobby. But if you look at the rest of what Suntory does in plant breeding, it's pretty amazing, and it's almost always good for Florida. And so one of the first ones I wanted to talk about is relatively new, and this is the Soiree Vinca. And they are everything you would expect from a Vinca: heat and drought tolerant, poor soil tolerant. The sun no mulch, bare ground tolerant. Whether they are fertile or sterile, I don't think anyone knows yet. But the difference is the flowers are tiny on them, and I don't believe anyone has tested them yet for sensitivity to aerial Phytophthora, which was always the problem for Catharanthus in the landscape. But great innovation for these tiny little flowers, and a full set of colors in the series. Really nice little plants. And one of my favorites is Mandevilla, and excuse me. I love these back when there was just a pink one, and that was all anybody seemed to know. But Suntory spent a lot of time mastering the hybridizing of these plants, and they are super complicated to hybridize. What their natural pollinator is tomato hornworm moth. So it's got the very long proboscis because it has to go through this convoluted S curve to get into the plant and reach the nectar. So they needed a very long proboscis on the moth to make pollinations. How Suntory figured out how to do this artificially, I do not know. I think there's one or two other companies who have even attempted, because it's a slow process, and they are just now beginning to break the color barriers so that we have whites, pinks, yellows, reds, on a variety of growth habits from shrub-like to vining. And just really nice breeding, a great innovation. And the taxonomists of the world, I think, keep flipping back and forth between the oleander family and the Asclepias family for Mandevilla. So it's somewhere in between those two. And as the molecular taxonomists figure it out, they'll let us know. But the sun parasol Mandevillas, great for Florida. They love the heat. They do not like wet conditions, and they do not like to be crowded with other plants. So I think of them as being more like a bougainvillea that does better all planted by itself. And you have to look to see which ones are vining and which ones are somewhat shrub-like. It makes a big difference depending on what you want in the landscape. Another really great, although not new, innovation from Suntory was the summer wave Terrenia. And this is a great example of seed versus vegetative plants. The seed varieties of Terrenia are nice, they're cute, they die in June, usually after a long chlorotic period, and then they reseed and move about the garden. So they can be nice as a seed plant, but the summer waves are this very wide cross of two species of Terrenia that probably never would have found each other in nature. And it's a sterile triploid, so it never sets seed, but it roots at every node as it grows along the ground. So it makes a great ground cover for part shade to sun, the main caveat being it likes moisture. So that can make a big difference on where it does well in the landscape. But blooms all season long, fabulous color, and a great little flowering ground cover. Not cold hardy, so not particularly winter hardy. Even here in Gainesville, it's very likely to die out each winter. Okay, Ball Horticultural is pretty much the last American-owned plant breeding corporation for ornamental plants. And they have done some amazing things. Certainly over time, they've been huge in American horticulture. But they're just a long-standing American tradition, and they are now duking it out with companies from all over the world that are much more global entities. The main thing that Pan American Seed, which is part of Ball Horticulture, as is Burpee Seed, is their release of the dragon wing begonias, which to me, dragon wing begonia is probably about one of the best landscape plants you will find for color. Pretty much disease-free, sun or shade, very easy to grow. Great plant altogether. And there's now a new one called Canary Wings that was found by a young man in the Midwest, which has chartreuse leaves with red flowers. So it's bright chartreuse green with red-orange blooms. So another great plant there. But those have been out for many years. What I wanted to talk about was the newer stuff. And Beacon Impatiens are seed Impatiens Walleriana, but Ball claims they are Downy Mildew resistant. So the seed Impatiens market in the United States was huge. And when it went away because of Downy Mildew, there was a lot of money lost. And so they are the first ones in with a, quote, disease-resistant line of plants. And otherwise, all the same things that made seed Impatiens so good before. So I'll be curious to see how resistant they are and how they prove out over time, because they've only been out for a year or two now. Petunias. Excuse me. Petunias are, there is a mutant gene that produces the green edge on petunia flowers. That same mutant gene, if you tweak it enough times, and believe me, the people in my industry will tweak it 1,000,000 times if it gives them something new, will give you these weird red tones, the black petunia, all of these new colors that you see. But unfortunately, in most cases, these are all old-fashioned seed petunias. So they will be dead by May for most of Florida. So you have from your last frost date until May before they're done. So for a lot of us, our last frost date is April 15th. It's kind of a short window for enjoying these plants. But this is one where you guys may see a lot of questions coming in going, why are my petunias dying so early? And it's because for some reason, when they started to do this new line of hybrids, they selected some of the most seed prone and earliest to finish varieties. So the genetics just aren't there yet. Maybe they'll get there eventually. But great colors. Can't fault the unique and beautiful colors on it. Another one from Ball, and again, I think this is a plant that's just getting a new look and a new interest, is bicolored, the tattoo line of Catharanthus. Now, these are regular size vinca, so there's not much difference from the vinca that we have currently, except for fairly unique colors all the way up to solid black. So there's a variety of new colors, heat tolerant, humidity tolerant. They look very promising. I have not had a chance to trial these in Florida yet. Okay, next, Proven Winners, which is not a plant breeding company, it's a marketing company. This is where I used to work. And so they would travel around the globe and work with different plant breeders to try and find the best plants that did well in all of our trial sites, which was 4 places in the United States and another 4 outside the United States. And so it was fun to do this because you got to see what really did perform everywhere. And you didn't have to worry about company lines. Well, we'd like to do that, but we didn't develop it, so we won't release it. Whereas with Proven Winners, you could step over the line with different companies and mix to get the best plants. One of the things that was probably most popular for Proven Winners was Diamond Frost Euphorbia. There are now probably 4 or 5 different lines of Euphorbia that are now available on the market. Most of them probably came from volunteer seedlings, which at first, and we'll talk about this again in a moment, were sterile. Diamond Frost was supposed to be sterile, but if you plant it often enough and you plant it in enough locations, eventually you will start to see some seed formation. And then if you select that seed and turn it into a new cultivar, you've already increased the chances of more seed down the line. So every generation of new varieties that comes out, you have to worry if they have not just developed a new invasive weed for us, because this Euphorbia, this group of Euphorbias that have the white bracts, is native to Florida, or at least, let's say, endemic to Florida. Maybe that's not even true. I think I have my words mixed up. Ubiquitous. It's all over in Florida, whether it's ours or somebody else's. It's known to be all throughout the southern US and Mexico down into Costa Rica. I've seen this plant growing out at the Gainesville airport, not exactly the same. It's a very clubby, tall, weird-looking Euphorbia, but it's definitely a close relative. So I worry about where this might be going in the future. So far, I don't know of anyone who has had issues with this in the landscape. But as it becomes more common and more commonly planted, I would have concerns to keep an eye out for it.
Hey, Rick, we've got about 3 minutes left if you want to
Okay.
kind of go through these next couple ones.
I will move quicker, thank you. Senorita Rosalita Cleome is a Cleome, very wide hybrid, so sterile. For Central and South Florida, you have a Cleome stem borer that in general pretty much takes it out entirely, but for North Florida, a fabulous summer flowering annual. You'll see the reemergence of calendula, which is more heat tolerant than it used to be. It's still not heat tolerant. So just be careful. It's got an extended spring season, but not a summer season. Vista Petunia, which is one of my favorites, is just one of the longest lasting petunias I've ever trialed. And it's a one-off mutation. Other than sports of it, we've never been able to recreate the additional 6 or 8 weeks of growth that it gave. One of the things you'll probably see a lot about in gardening magazines right now is Mangave, which is an interesting name, but it's essentially Manfreda crossed with agave. So it gives you the look of agave without the sharp spines. And it's there's a few other subtle differences. They're generally smaller, but really great textures. So for the succulent market or for low water use landscapes, the Mangaves, I think, are going to become more popular as time goes on. Okay, last bit, and you guys probably know these people. I just think it's amazing. Right now, the University of Florida is in the middle of a plant breeding sort of renaissance where there's a lot of people working on horticultural crops, and maybe people that you guys have had talk to you or should look at for speakers in the future. The first of it being Dave Clark, who is pretty much the king of coleus in the United States now. Ball Horticulture, Duman, which is one of the largest German suppliers, Proven Winners, and 2 or 3 other smaller companies all sell coleus bred in Gainesville almost entirely. That's all that's out there anymore. So for Dave, in about 15 years, his breeding sort of took over the market because it's late to flower and heat and humidity tolerant. Dr. Zanao Deng down at the Gulf Coast Research Center is working in caladiums, and he's also working for sterility in lantana, which is great news. We definitely need lantana that don't produce seed. It is a long-term process anytime you are breeding for sterility, especially with something like lantana, where they become more fertile the more you mix the cultivars. So it'll be interesting to see where that breeding leads in the future. And then I just met Dr. Huo at the Apopka Research Center, and he is doing heat tolerance for begonias, as well as a variety of other sort of lab-related breeding things and other crops. What a great guy. Really enjoyed meeting him and seeing his programs. And then last but not least, some things you may see in the future, the new low-hanging fruit Bidens. I don't know if Biden's alba, which is in bloom everywhere across Florida right now, has ever been put into any of the Biden's breeding, but I love the white tips on the yellow flowers. The orange varieties are really not particularly heat loving, so currently Biden's is more for the north. However, Pentas are getting a lot of coverage for new varieties. Still, the old ruby red or red ruby is the best for pollinators. A lot of times with breeding like this, you lose the nectaries when you do the hybrids. And so with Pentas, a lot of them do not attract pollinators anymore. So one thing that you guys can help with and probably do is to evaluate the different Pentas varieties to see which ones really are pollinator friendly. And salvia, there's going to be a lot of new stuff. Anyway, sorry, run over. It's thank you guys again. You do so much, and proud to know you. So thanks,
Rick,
Wendy.
thank you so much. You all, if you have questions for Rick, go ahead and email them to me, and I will get those messages to you. And Rick, we can't thank you enough. We got quite the education, and excited about new plans. Thank you for being with us, and please extend my thanks to Linda for loaning you to us for this morning. We really appreciate.
Say hi to everybody.
Awesome, awesome. Okay, Rick, everybody else, go ahead and refer to the email that I sent you last night and select your next session, because we have our next sessions going on. Dr. Kern with invasive animals, understanding climate change. And it's time to switch over to your next session. So thank you all very much.